Dear learners, welcome to the massive open online course on public financial administration. In today's lecture, we are going to see deficit financing and the various types of deficits. I am your instructor and I am Dr. Shobana Karthikeyan, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Madras Christian College, Chennai. In today's lecture, we will be understanding what exactly is meant by a deficit. We then move on to understanding what is deficit financing. We also understand what are the various types of deficits. There are four major types of deficits that we need to understand. One is the revenue deficit, the budgetary deficit, the fiscal deficit, and the primary deficit. We will also be understanding what it means to have these deficits in the economy. So, what exactly, in which way these deficits hamper the functioning of the economy. So, trends in deficits are also something that we will be seeing. We will have a couple of graphs to look at that, and then we will conclude with this session. So, a deficit is any one of the situation that can happen in a budget. So, any budget can have three possible outcomes. One is that it could be a surplus budget where the revenue can exceed the expenditure, or it could be a balanced budget where the revenue exactly equals its expenditure. The third situation that can happen is where the revenue falls short of expenditure. So, a public deficit can happen where the public revenue falls short of public expenditure. So, this definitely is going to be a problem for the economy because the government probably has to resort to a loan to tide over this deficit. So, deficits in general are measured over the course of a defined period of time. Generally, they are measured over a fiscal year. So, what exactly is deficit financing? So, should the situation arise where the expenditure has overshot the revenue, then the situation has to be made good. In that case, the gap is financed either by borrowing or by printing of currency. This is called as deficit financing. The Oxford Dictionary refers to deficit financing as the government funding of spending by borrowing, right? So, there can be a deficit. A deficit is one of the three situations that can happen in a budget, and when a deficit arises, either a loan has to be taken to tide over the situation or there has to be printing of currency. So, when the government funding of spending happens by borrowing, we talk about having caused a deficit financing situation. So, going forward, we are going to see the types of deficits that can occur. We are going to look at some clippings from the Indian economy textbook Dutt and Mahajan. So, that is from the 72nd edition. So, we will have some examples. I would strongly encourage learners to sit with some writing material so that the deficits can be worked out while I am explaining it to you. So, moving back to the various types of deficits, there are four deficits that can occur. One is a revenue deficit. The second one is a budget deficit, also called as a budgetary deficit. The third one is a fiscal deficit, and the fourth one is the primary deficit. So, we will be looking at the definition of each of these, and we will also be seeing how we are going to arrive at computing these, because we have some calculations, we will be doing some calculations. So, calculations of deficits, this is a screen which I would want you to see. One, the statistics for the year 1991 are the actuals that were actually spent, and this is taken from the book where the 2014-15 figures are the budgeted amounts. So, if you will look under the items, you have the revenue receipts, the capital receipts, which is again divided into two. A looks at loan recoveries and other receipts, and 2B speaks about borrowings and other liabilities. I will come back to this point 2B, which is borrowing and other liabilities, when we discuss the third type of deficit, which is the fiscal deficit. And once we do look at fiscal deficit, we will be able to derive the primary deficit from that as well. So now moving back, the point number 3 talks about total receipts, point 4 is about revenue expenditure, point 5 is about capital expenditure and total expenditure. So this is a budget snapshot for 2 years. 1990-91 is the actual figures and 2014-15 is the budgeted figures which is taken from the textbook. So we will just work with these numbers for the purposes of understanding the deficits. Moving on, we now move on to the first concept of deficit, which is the revenue deficit. The concept of revenue deficit is simple and straightforward. It only speaks about the revenue components of the budget. So here we are going to talk about revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. If you are going to pit these two against each other, you may arrive at a revenue deficit. So a revenue deficit indicates the failure of the economy to even meet its current expenditure from current revenue. So for example, if the government is even incompetent to pay salaries to its staff, you are talking about a probable situation of a revenue deficit. So if we are going to calculate the revenue deficit here, we will be taking this from this master budget snapshot that we saw. We will be looking at revenue receipts. First we will compute for the year 1990-91. The amount is 54,950. And moving on, revenue expenditure is 73,510. So here we can obviously see that revenue expenditure has overshot revenue receipts. So it is going to be a deficit scenario here. Therefore, the deficit is to the tune of minus 18,560. In other words, the government has incurred a revenue deficit of 18,560. Any deficit is always indicated by a minus sign, right? So for the year 1990-91, we have landed with a revenue deficit of minus 18,560. So if we were to compute the same thing for the year 2015, it does not matter to us whether these are budgeted amounts or actual amounts. We have some numbers to work with right now. So if the revenue receipts as it has been pulled out from the master snapshot is 11,41,575 crores and revenue expenditure is 15,36,047 crores. So obviously you can see that this is a case of again a revenue deficit. We have a revenue deficit to the tune of 3,94,472. Again, this amount will be preceded by a minus because it is a revenue deficit. So just to go back to this one, a revenue deficit is a very simple and straightforward computation to do. It is the revenue receipts minus revenue expenditure. If the expenditure is more than the revenue, then naturally we are going to talk about a revenue deficit. In the present example that we have taken, in both the years, in 1990-91 as well as in 2014-15, we land with a revenue deficit. Okay. So now we move on to the budget deficit. It is also called as a budgetary deficit. So again, this is also fairly straightforward to understand. We are going to talk about the total receipts, which mean the revenue and capital receipts put together minus the total expenditure. Again, revenue and capital put together. So when you are going to talk about total receipts minus total expenditure, we are going to talk about budget deficit or budgetary deficit. Both mean exactly the same. So first let's go ahead and compute it for the year 1990-91. We do see that the revenue receipt is at 54,950. To this we add the capital receipts at 39,010 crores, which lands us with a total receipts of 93,960. So with this we move on to computing the total expenditure. Total expenditure is going to be revenue expenditure of 73,510 plus capital expenditure of 31,800. So, together 1,05,310 crore. So, the numbers that are of importance to us are the numbers in bold, which is the total receipts of 93,960 and the total expenditure of 1,05,310 crores. We can naturally see that the budgetary deficit is also a deficit again. So, you have a deficit of minus 11,350 crores. Okay. So, if we were to do the same calculation for the year 2015, we are going to add the revenue receipts of 11,41,575. To this add the capital receipts. I would just like to take a moment and take you to this master sheet. It does not matter to us again whether it is A or B. So, we are going to put all of this together here and we are going to talk about 6,35,902, any receipt, right. So, this comes to 17,77,477 in total receipts. Just a question of simple arithmetic. So, moving on, the revenue expenditure is at 15,36,047 crore and capital expenditure is to the tune of 2,41,430. This is a classic case of a balanced budget. We do see that the total receipts balance out the total expenditure. So, the total receipts and the total expenditure evens out in this case. So, the budgetary deficit we are going to have a nil or a 0. So, I already told you there are three possible outcomes of a budget. One, it could be a deficit or it could be a surplus or it could be a balanced budget. This is a classic case. 2014-15, the budgeted numbers that have been taken from the book Dutt and Mahajan speak of a budgetary deficit which is at nil because it is a balanced budget here, right. So, moving on with understanding what the budgetary deficit is. If we noticed, we did a grave blunder when we were calculating the budgetary deficit. We put together capital receipts of all types. Again, capital, I did tell you that I will come back to point 2b when we are discussing fiscal deficit, and this is the time to discuss 2b, which is borrowing and other liabilities. So, 2 stands for capital receipts, 2a stands for loan recoveries and other receipts of capital nature. Fair enough, that definitely merits a place with the capital receipt. Alright. But now when we are looking at 2b, if we read it once again, it is borrowing and other liabilities. It actually means that the money that has actually come to us, which has been filed under the capital receipt, is not a receipt in the first place. It is actually a borrowing. So, the government of India has been making a huge error in terms of classification of a borrowing and a liability under a capital receipt. So, if you will see this, the budgetary deficit must have been inflated to the tune of 2b, 33,300 and 5,55,649, right. So, it is time to make amends and to arrive at the actual budgetary deficit. So, this basic mistake, which was the calculation of capital receipts by the Finance Ministry of the Government of India, continued for about 4 or 5 plus decades. It was only the first person to bring attention to this was B.R. Shenoy, but again it did not find favor, and eventually when the Sukhmoy Chakraborty committee did put the spotlight on this grave error that was being committed year after year, we did correct the mistake that was going on, and the concept of fiscal deficit was born in India. So, the treatment of capital receipts in the calculation of deficits. So, it is recoveries, to sum up this entire point once again, capital receipts are the sum of recoveries of loans, other receipts of a capital nature, and borrowing and other liabilities. So, this is a false plus that has to be taken out of the receipts, receipts that we calculated under the budgetary deficit. So, this third source, the borrowing or liabilities, are not receipts of the government and they should not be included under the capital receipts. They are liabilities of the Government of India. They have to be paid with interest in the coming years. So, they also have to be a part of the budget deficit actually. Now, arriving at the concept of fiscal deficit can be calculated in two ways. So, just before we move on to that, we will just look at a brief history of the fiscal deficit. So, B.R. Shenoy was the first economist to point out as far back as in 1954-55 the dangerous implications of regarding market borrowings and other capital receipts as a part of governmental receipts. So, this warning was brushed aside by the government. Finally, the Sukhmoy Chakravarti Committee on the working of the monetary system in India pointed out an inherent flaw, an inherent weakness in how we were calculating our budgetary deficit. So, the committee emphasized that this should be taken out of the calculation. Instead, it should be attached with the existing deficit. So, therefore, from the year 1997-98, we have had a third concept of deficit known as the fiscal deficit. So, the conventional concept of deficit financing was phased out and we adopted the concept of fiscal deficit from the year 1997 to 98. So, this is a very brief history of the birth of fiscal deficit in India. So, what exactly does a fiscal deficit stand for? What is its significance? A fiscal deficit thus indicates the total borrowing requirements of the governments from all possible sources. So, from the point of view of the economy, the fiscal deficit is the most significant and it is the most comprehensive way of understanding the deficit needs of the government. It actually shows the gap between the government receipts and the government expenditure. It reflects the true extent of borrowing by the government in a given fiscal year. So, all along what had been done was not true. So, because borrowing was considered a receipt, so it was a false number. So, when we look at the fiscal deficit, we are actually looking at the right numbers staring at our faces. On the other hand, the conventional concept of budgetary deficit reflects only the government borrowing from the RBI, right? So, fiscal deficits, if we have to go into the formula, there are two ways of doing it. Both ways lead us to the same destination. One, you do the formula from scratch. You look at it from the revenue receipts, you add capital receipts and then include those capital receipts only of a real receipt nature and then take out total receipts from it. That is one way of looking at it. The second way is to correct the budgetary deficit formula that we have already worked out. So, to the budgetary deficit, add the government's market borrowing, you will anyway arrive at the fiscal deficit, right? So, there are two formulas in calculating fiscal deficit. The first formula is the formula we will have to do from scratch. We will look at the revenue receipts, we will look at capital receipts only of a true capital nature. We will not be looking at market borrowings and other liabilities because they are not receipts and they are liabilities. So, to this we will compare the total expenditure, capital and revenue expenditure and arrive at the fiscal deficit. This is one way of calculating it. The second way of calculating it is there anyway has been a computation for the budgetary deficit. So, to this add the item that was wrongly entered as a receipt. So, to this deficit add that amount of market borrowing, Therefore, we will arrive at the same fiscal deficit. We will see how it happens in the examples. So, this is the first method of computing fiscal deficit. So, we have the revenue. First, look at the numbers for the year 1990-91. So, we will be seeing the revenue receipts at 54,950. To this, add capital receipts. So, we will arrive at the total receipts here, which is at 60,660. Till here, there is no problem. So, again we have the revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure totaling to 1,05,310. If we are going to take off receipts minus expenditure, we are going to arrive at a fiscal deficit of 44,650. So, we have to make a quick comparison here. Under the budgetary deficit, the amount was 11,350, and precisely by this amount, which is borrowing and market liability of 33,300. That is precisely the difference between the budgetary deficit and the fiscal deficit. So, this was a wrong plus. We made it a correct negative here when we calculated the fiscal deficit. This is one way of looking at it. If we have to do the same computation for the year 14-15, we do the revenue receipts, we do the capital receipts, and then we arrive at the total receipts of 12,21,828. To this, we are going to take off revenue expenditure and capital expenditure totaling to 17,77,477. So, what is the fiscal deficit here? It is 5,55,649. And what was the budgetary deficit in the previous case that we saw? It was nil. So, if you will see the entire budgetary deficit which was nil, now the entire fiscal deficit here in this case is the borrowing and other liabilities. Do you see the stark difference between the two situations? On one hand, we were lauding ourselves, giving ourselves a pat on the back, saying that we had a budget with neither a surplus nor a deficit. It was a balanced budget. But in this case, look at the amount of fiscal deficit, 5,55,649. This is the concept of fiscal deficit that we need to understand clearly. So, now moving on with the second computation. So, we already have the budgetary deficit, the numbers are already there with us. To this, add the borrowing and other liabilities by the government. In the case of 1990-91, the numbers are 33,300, giving us 44,650. In the year 2014-15, the budgetary deficit was nil. We are going to add the entire borrowing and other liability, which is precisely the fiscal deficit as well. So, you will see that the fiscal deficit method 1 and method 2 yields precisely the same numbers, right? So, moving on to understanding what is India's current fiscal deficit. In the year 2021-22, India's budget gap amounted to 6.7% of the gross domestic product. The budget shortfall in 2022-23 is expected to amount to 6.4%. So, by 2025-26, the government is slowly trying to phase out the fiscal deficit. So, we probably would be heading to 4.5% of the GDP. So, for the present fiscal year 2023-24, the fiscal deficit is predicted to be 5.9% of the GDP. Because of the COVID and other external shocks to the economy, naturally our fiscal deficit went up hugely. It has to be brought back to the FRBM recommendations only in a phased manner. So, moving on to understanding the trends in deficits over the past few years. So, this is taken from the Union Budget document in the government website. So, we do see the deficits as a part of the percentages. We did speak about fiscal deficit, it is at 6.7%. In the year 2022-23, it was 6.4. Moving on to 5.9 in the year 23-24, which will be brought down hopefully to 4.5% in the year 2025-26. Again, revenue deficits also have been higher in the year 2021-22 due to the COVID aftermath, and this is going to dip to 2.9% in the year 2023-24. So, moving on to the fourth concept of deficit, which is the primary deficit. So, in recent years, the Finance Ministry has introduced the fourth concept of a deficit, which is known as the primary deficit. So, we have been speaking a lot about servicing the debt, the public debt. So, servicing happens when we are going to pay interest for all the loans that have been taken so far. So, when this interest component can be just pulled out from the deficit, what is it that the country actually needed in the form of deficit to run the nation? So, that statistic is the primary deficit. So, the primary deficit is going to be the fiscal deficit minus the interest payment. So, it shows the requirement of the borrowing of the government and excludes any kind of interest component attached to it. It also highlights the amount of government expenses that need to be met through borrowing other than the interest payment. We will be seeing that interest payments are a huge chunk that are attached to the fiscal deficit. If that can be pulled out, what really happens? So, you will see that the fiscal deficit, the primary deficit is way smaller than the fiscal deficit. So, a decrease in the primary deficit reflects the improvement in the fiscal health of the economy. When the primary deficit becomes zero, it suggests the government only needs to borrow to pay off the interest payments. So, bringing, of course, it's almost impossible to bring the primary deficit to zero, but every country definitely looks for definite fiscal health of the economy. So, in that case, if theoretically the primary deficit percentage is going to be zero, the only thing that is going to remain in the fiscal deficit is the interest component that is there, that anyway has to be taken care of. The prudent financial management requires that the government does not borrow to consume in the normal course. So, even the primary deficit is expressed as a percentage of the GDP. So, if back to the statistics, we have a fiscal deficit of 44,650. Those calculations we have already done earlier, and we had a fiscal deficit of 5,55,649. So, I would like you to look at the interest components here. The interest components for the year 1990-91 is about 21,500 and a whooping 4,56,145 for the year 2014-15. So, just look at the amount of interest that the country pays just because it has taken a loan earlier. So, now it will be easy to connect the dots and to understand why a public debt acts as a huge growth retarding factor, because no public debt comes free, the debt has to be serviced, so interest has to be paid, the interest has to be paid year on year, and that is a huge component of the GDP. So, if we have to calculate primary deficit here, the fiscal deficit minus interest payments lead to the primary deficit here. Of course, in this example, I am not calculating it as a percentage of the GDP, but in general, it is definitely calculated as a percentage. We will just do the basic arithmetic here and leave it here. So, for the year 1990-91, the fiscal deficit is 44,650, interest payments come to 21,500. Therefore, the primary deficit is 23,150, almost half. So, in the case of 2014-15, we had a fiscal deficit of 5,55,649 and the interest payments were 4,56,145. So, it's about 99,504 crores. So, that is going to be the primary deficit. So, you can see what a huge chunk of fiscal deficit just the interest payments constitute. Yes. So, moving on, the primary deficit numbers here are shown in the slide. In the revenue budget, the deficit was 4.1% of the GDP in 2022-23. In the union budget, the revenue deficit is 2.9% of the GDP. if interest payments are deducted from the fiscal deficit, it stood at about 3% of the GDP, which are the revised estimates here. So, the primary deficit, which reflects the current financial stance or the present fiscal health of the country, devoid of any baggage, interest baggage that the government may carry, is pegged at 2.3% of the GDP in the Union Budget 2023-24. These numbers are important. Of course, in the previous example that we calculated it only as numbers, but in reality the primary deficit, all deficits for that matter, are spoken of in the context of GDP. So, how are the deficits faring when it comes to having the GDP in its denominator? So, the trends of GDP can be seen once again. So, the effective revenue deficit is at 1.7%. So, I would quickly like you to take you back to what we did in this present class. We discussed what exactly is a deficit. A deficit is one of the situations that a budget can have. The other two situations are a surplus and a balanced budget. So, we moved on to discussing deficit financing. So, if a deficit should occur, so how can the government make good that situation? So, the types of deficits majorly, at least in the Indian context, are four. One is the revenue deficit, the budget or the budgetary deficit is the second one, the third one is the fiscal deficit, and the fourth one is the primary deficit. So, we did look at the huge flaw that happened in the budgetary deficit calculations in the budget documents in the Government of India for almost 4.5 decades. So, because a wrong had to be corrected, it got corrected in the form of a new formula based on the recommendations of the Sukhmay Chakravarti committee, and that happened by means of bringing in a new formula of fiscal deficit in the context of India. So, we did see the trends in deficit. On the whole, the primary deficit speaks about the fiscal health of the country after releasing it from the bondage of any previous debt burden that it may have. Okay, with this I will end this class and I will be happy to take any questions online. Thank you so much.